We are discussing European culture. This is in a series. We have been discussing history. Actually, Uno-san, are you recording?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. All right.
Today is your voice is okay. Last week though, last week it was so terrible, but this week is okay. You're networking well. Okay, no problem.
No problem. No, I don't think that there's a problem. So we're discussing history in Europe. We have been discussing the Greek Empire, the City Empire, the Roman Empire. We have been looking at the Middle Ages, the role of the Church, the power struggle with the kings, and that led to the Reformation. We have been discussing the Renaissance and the First Industrial Revolution, then colonialism, role of colonialism and decolonialization. Last week we discussed World War I, and this Saturday we discussed World War II. And today we're going to look at the aftermath after World War II. We ended up in a period of Cold War, and that's what I would like to show the first video. That's the Cold War period and the period of how Europe got divided into, or actually the world got divided into. So let's have a look here. Oh, sorry. You cannot hear this probably. Can you?
No. Also, you need to switch your screen.
Right. We cannot use that. First. Okay. Can you see it now?
Oh yeah.
And sound okay.
In the USSR and the USA that played out globally. We've tried to shy away from calling conflicts ideological or civilizational here on Crash Course, but in this case, the clash of civilizations model really does apply. Socialism, at least as Marx constructed it, wanted to take over the world, and many Soviets saw themselves in a conflict with bourgeois capitalism itself. And the Soviets saw American rebuilding efforts in Europe and Japan as the US trying to expand its market, which, by the way, is exactly what we were doing. So the US feared that the USSR wanted to destroy democratic and capitalist institutions, and the Soviets feared that the US wanted to use its money and power to dominate Europe and eventually destroy the Soviet system. And both parties were right to be worried. It's not paranoia if they really are out to get you. Now, of course, we've seen a lot of geopolitical struggles between major world powers here on Crash Course, but this time there was the special added bonus that war could lead to the destruction of the human species. That was new for world history, and it's worth remembering it's still new. Here's the period of time we've discussed on Crash Course, and this is how long we've had the technological capability to exterminate ourselves. So that's worrisome. Immediately after World War II, the Soviets created a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, dominating the countries where the Red Army had pushed back the Nazis. Which is why Winston Churchill famously said in 1946 that an iron curtain and descended across Europe. While the dates of the Cold War are usually given between 1945 and 1990, a number of historians will tell you that it actually started during World War II. Stalin's distrust of the US and Britain kept growing as they refused to invade Europe and open up a second front against the Nazis, and some even say that the decision to drop the first atomic bombs on Japan was motivated in part by a desire to intimidate the Soviets. That sort of worked, but only insofar as it motivated the Soviets to develop atomic bombs of their own. They successfully tested their first one in 1949. From the beginning, the US had the advantage because it had more money and power and could provide Europe protection, what with its army and one-of-a-kind nuclear arsenal, while Europe rebuilt. The USSR had to rebuild itself, and also they had the significant disadvantage of being controlled by noted asshat Joseph Stalin. I will remind you, it's not cursing if he's wearing an ass for a hat. Oh, I guess it's time for the open letter. An open letter to Joseph Stalin. But first, let's see what's in the secret compartment today. Oh, it's Silly Putty. Silly Putty, the thing that won the Cold War. This is exactly the kind of useless consumer good that would never have been produced in the Soviet Union. And it is because we had so much more consumer spending on stuff like Silly Putty that we won the Cold War. Go team! Dear Joseph Stalin, you really sucked. There was a great moment in your life at your first wife's funeral when you said, "I don't think I shall ever love again." And then later, you had that wife's whole family killed. Putting aside the fact that you're responsible for tens of millions of deaths, I don't like you because of the way you treated your son Yakov. I mean, you were really mean to him, and then he shot himself, and he didn't die, and you said, he can't even shoot straight. And then later, when he was captured during World War II, you had a chance to exchange prisoners for him, but you declined. And then he died at a prison camp. You were a terrible leader, a terrible person, and a terrible father. Best wishes, John Green. All right, let's go to the thought bubble. Europe was the first battleground of the Cold War, especially Germany, which was divided into two parts, with the former capital, Berlin, also divided into two parts. And yes, I know the western part was divided into smaller occupation zones, but I'm simplifying. In 1948, the Soviets tried to cut off West Berlin by closing the main road that led into the city, but the Berlin airlift stopped them. And then in 1961, the Soviets tried again, and this time they were much more successful, building a wall around West Berlin, although it's worth noting that the thing was up for less than 30 years. I mean, Meatloaf's career has lasted longer than the Berlin Wall did. The U.S. response to the Soviets was a policy called containment. It basically involved stopping the spread of communism by standing up to the Soviets wherever they seemed to want to expand. In Europe, this meant spending a lot of money. First, the Marshall Plan spent $13 billion on rebuilding Western Europe with grants and credits that Europeans would spend on American consumer goods and on construction. Capitalism's cheap food and plentiful stuff, it was hoped, would stop the spread of communism. The U.S. also tried to slow the spread of communism by founding NATO and with CIA interventions in elections where communists had a chance, as in Italy. But despite all the great spy novels and shaken, not stirred martinis, the Cold War never did heat up in Europe. Probably the most important part of the Cold War that people just don't remember these days is the nuclear arms race. Both sides developed nuclear arsenals, the Soviets initially with the help of spies who stole American secrets. Eventually, the nuclear arsenals were so big that the US and USSR agreed on a strategy appropriately called MAD, which stood for Mutually Assured Destruction. Thanks, Thought Bubble. And yes, nuclear weapons were and are capable of destroying humanity many times over. But only once or twice did we get close to nuclear war, during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, and then again in 1983 when we forgot to give the Russians the heads up that we were doing some war games, which made it look like we had launched a first strike. Our bad! But even though mutually assured destruction prevented direct conflict, there was plenty of hot war in the Cold War. The Korean War saw lots of fighting between communists and capitalists, as did the Vietnam War. I mean, these days we remember the domino effect as silly paranoia, but after Korea and especially China became communist, Vietnam's movement toward communism seemed very much a threat to Japan, which the U.S. had helped remake into a vibrant capitalist ally. So the U.S. got bogged down in one of its longest wars, while the Soviets assisted the North Vietnamese army and the Viet Cong. But then we paid them back by supporting the anti-communist Mujahideen after the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979. Of course, as we now know, nobody conquers Afghanistan, unless you are the Mongols. So after 10 disastrous years, the Soviets finally abandoned Afghanistan. Some of those Mujahideen later became members of the Taliban, though, so it's difficult to say that anyone won that war. But it wasn't just Asia. In Nicaragua, the U.S. supported rebels to overthrow the leftist government. In El Salvador, the U.S. bolstered authoritarian regimes that were threatened by left-wing guerrillas. The United States ended up supporting a lot of awful governments, like the one in Guatemala, which held on to power through the use of death squads. Frankly, all our attempts to stabilize governments in Latin America led to some very unstable Latin American governments and quite a lot of violence. And then there were the lukewarm conflicts, like the Suez Canal crisis, where British and French paratroopers were sent in to try to stop Egypt from nationalizing the Suez Canal, or all the American covert operations to keep various countries from falling to communism. These included the famous CIA-engineered coup to overthrow Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh after his government attempted to nationalize Iran's oil industry, and the CIA helping Chile's General Augusto Pinochet overthrow democratically elected Marxist President Salvador Allende in 1973. And lest we think the Americans were the only bad guys in this, the Soviets used force to crush popular uprisings in Hungary in 1956 and in Czechoslovakia in 1968. So you may have noticed that our discussion of the Cold War has branched out from Europe to include Asia and the Middle East and Latin America, and in fact almost every part of the globe was involved in some way, with the planet being divided into three worlds. The first world was the US, Western Europe, and any place that embraced capitalism and a more or less democratic form of government. The second world was the Soviet Union and its satellites, mostly the Warsaw Pact nations, China and Cuba. The third world was everyone else, and we don't use this term anymore because it lumps together a hugely diverse range of countries. We'll talk more about the specific economic and development challenges faced by the so-called third world countries, but the big one in terms of the Cold War was that neither the US nor the Soviets wanted any of these countries to remain neutral. Every nation was supposed to pick sides, either capitalist or communist, and while it seems like an easy choice now, in the 50s and 60s it wasn't nearly so clear. I mean, for a little while it seemed like the Soviets might come out ahead, at least in the third world. For a while, capitalism, and especially the United States, seemed to lose some of its luster. The US propped up dictatorships, had a poor civil rights record, we sucked at women's gymnastics, plus the Soviets were the first to put a satellite, a man and a dog into space. Plus, Marxists just seemed cooler, which is why you never see Milton Friedman t-shirts. Till now, available at theftba.com. I like that stand, but I'm more of a centrist. Can I get a Keynes shirt? Yes. Now that's hot. But Soviet socialism did not finally prove to be a viable alternative to industrial capitalism. Over time, state-run economies just generally don't fare as well as private enterprise, and people like living in a world where they can have more stuff. More importantly, Soviet policies were just bad. Collectivized agriculture stymied production and led to famine. Suppression of dissent and traditional cultures made people angry, and no one liked suffering the humiliation of driving a Yugo. But why the Cold War ended with an the most interesting questions of the 20th century. It probably wasn't Ronald Reagan bankrupting the Soviets, despite what some politicians believe. The USSR had more satellite states that it needed to spend more to prop up than the US had to invest in its allies, and the Soviet system could never keep up with economic growth in the West. But probably the individual most responsible for the end of the Cold War was Mikhail Baryshnikov. No, Mikhail Gorbachev? Well, that's boring. I always thought the Soviets danced their way to freedom, no? It was glasnost and perestroika? Right, but Gorbachev's perestroika and glasnost opened up the Soviet political and economic systems with contested local elections, less restricted civil society groups, less censorship, more autonomy for the Soviet republics, more non-state-run businesses, and more autonomy for state-run farms. Glasnost, or openness, led to more information from the West, and less censorship led to a flood of criticism as people realized how much poorer the Second World was than the First. And one by one, often quite suddenly, former communist states collapsed. In Germany, the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, and East and West Germany were reunited in 1990. In Poland, the Gdansk Dock Workers Union Solidarity turned into a mass political movement and won 99 of the 100 seats it was allowed to contest in the 1989 election. Hungary held multi-party elections in 1990. The same year, mass demonstrations led to elections in Czechoslovakia. In 1993, that country split up into Slovakia and the Czech Republic, the happiest and most mutually beneficial divorce since Cher left Sunny. Of course, sometimes the transition away from communism was violent and painful. In Romania, for instance, the communist dictator Ceausescu held on to power until he was tried and put before a firing squad at the end of 1989, and it took until 1996 for a non-communist government to take power there. And in Yugoslavia, well, not so great. And in Russia, it's a little bit Putin-y. Yeah, Putin! But just 20 years later, it's hard to believe that the world was once dominated by two superpowers held in check by mutually assured destruction. What's really amazing to me, though, is that until the late 1980s, it felt like the Cold War was going to go on forever. Time seems to slow as it approaches us, and living in the post-Cold War nuclear age, we should remember that the past feels distant, even when it's near, and that the future seems assured, even though it isn't. Thanks for watching.
Very well prepared, huh?
So yeah, this is incredibly high speed, but very informative.
Too much, yeah. I written up democracy in all the world, so I easily understand. But usually, like East Europe or Latin America, they are not. If you are not familiar with it, very difficult to understand, right?
Right. Yeah. So we've been discussing these topics quite in depth, but yeah. So basically, the Cold War started already during World War II. I think he gave a number of options. I think it already started during World War II, where basically the West needed Russia and the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union needed the Allied forces because they had a common enemy, but they were certainly not friends. Stalin, where we may accuse the Soviet Union of starting it by signing the peace treaty with Germany, but that was short-lived, and Stalin was then pissed off that Western nations did not come to form a front on the western side. So that was the beginning of the end, and even as World War II played out, the Soviet Union actually they had much more casualties than the Allied forces. I believe about 20 million Russian people died because of World War II, because of famine and just by being killed. So that was enormous. Enormous large number. So Russia, the Soviet Union paid very high sacrifices, and it was very clear that there was a race going on. Like, okay, how are we going to towards the end of the war? Maybe it was one objective was to eradicate, to stop Germany, but the other one was to quickly catch as much land as possible. One of the reasons why probably United States actually wanted to end the war with Japan and through atomic bombs was maybe because they wanted to be first and avoid Soviet Union for taking control over Japan. Same thing happened in Europe. In Europe, actually, this is a history that's kind of relatable for me because I lived through part of it, so I can very clearly remember the division division East and West, and as he said towards the end of the movie, I can really also feel like when I was a kid, then this history, that situation of communism versus capitalism was very real. It was always assumed that if this was going to get hot, that it would get hot in Germany, Netherlands, and the nuclear war would not take place in Soviet Union or in the United States, but actually in Europe. That's where it would take place, and it was we were very worried about it. There were within Europe there were strong divisions between people who were very much in favor of this system of MAD, of mutual deterrence, where they wanted to oh shit, my laundry is hanging out. It's raining. Okay, so there was this system of mutual deterrence where both sides could destroy each other many times around, but did not. Can I have 1 second? I'm going to take in my laundry. 1 second.
By the way, Malaysia and Penang is the same time zone, right? 2 hours earlier than
Yes.
Japan, right?
2 hours behind. But Malaysia, I think is 1 hour.
1 hour.
1 hour till Japan.
So Takashi is 2 hours behind, and Penang 1 hour behind. Okay.
It's in, it's falling down like there's no tomorrow. Oh,
What are you doing there?
I had my laundry out, and it's raining very hard here.
What?
It's raining very hard here, no? Can you hear me? Oro-san, can you hear me?
Yeah. I can hear you.
Oh, okay. Sorry
By the
about that.
way, you are in your house, right?
Right.
What do you mean raining?
Raining?
What do you say?
It's raining very, very hard.
What's hard?
Raining.
What do you mean raining?
Raining. But I mean raining. It's raining very, very hard.
Oh, you're going back to Soviet?
No.
Okay, I thought you were
Yeah.
talking about the laundry.
Yeah. No. We talk about laundry. So it's raining very hard. So I needed to take in the laundry.
Oh, okay. Now you settle?
Sorry.
You settle?
Yeah, I'm settled.
Okay,
I'm settled.
go ahead.
Sorry about that. Okay. So the impact of the start of the Cold War, it started actually before during World War II. Then after that there was this period where the United States grew its influence by establishing NATO, by giving out the Marshall Aid, that actually was very successful in revitalizing the West European nations. Japan was a very good, bold and good economic move that benefited us and the United States, because they actually also got a lot of influence through that, and a lot of our spending also went to the United States. So it also stimulated the American economy. So a very successful plan. And one reason, one major explanation for the end of the Cold War was actually that we were just much more economically successful than Eastern Europe. So the Soviet Union had to support many countries who were dysfunctioning because there were not the right incentives. He uses the example of silly putty. I don't know if you know silly putty, but I do. It's a very stupid, slimy stuff that it doesn't do anything. It's just you can just run it through your fingers, and it feels a bit strange. It looks a little bit like like what comes from your nose, and those kinds of this kind of consumerism was one of the drivers behind basically the West winning over East side, the capitalism winning from communism, because we just make more money, and the individual economies would thrive much more than the communist regimes. The Soviet Union could not keep up, and Gorbachev came to power. He created this policy of perestroika and glasnost, and soon everything changed, and very rapidly. How economies went from communist to capitalist. Institutes that seemed never to change, like East German Stasi, and all these institutes changed overnight. It was really amazing what was happening. I wrote my thesis about the transformation around that era in 1994, about the future of the economic, the globalization in the former communist countries in Europe, and so I studied it a lot. And at the time, it was it was really people just went through this period of this rapid transition, and they had quite a lot of money, because there was nothing they could spend it on at the time, but that was soon gone. So the money was there, but they didn't have the means. Countries like Soviet Union, it became more or less ruled by the mafia. There were a few very rich people came out of this. They took control over the natural resources, oil and other minerals, and they took a lot of their wealth to other countries like England, where they lived a billionaire life, but they left the Soviet Union with very little, and so there was this period of more or less a depression where the people were disappointed in the transition to the West, especially the people who grew up under in the communist era. There were a lot of things that were not so good during that time. You didn't have a freedom to express yourself. There were a lot of things that were not available at the time, and you were under constant surveillance. But on the other hand, people had jobs, people had money coming in, and you didn't have to die. There was free education, healthcare, these things. So people were being taken care of, and a lot of people after the transformation from the communist system to the capitalist system got very sentimental, and wanted to go back to that period. So for example, the example of Ceausescu in Romania, it took even 6-7 years before the first more capitalist parties started to control the country, and other countries also saw that movement where initially everybody was very enthusiastic and everything could happen, but then it soon turned out that it would take a little bit more time before these countries could catch up. Notable exception, Eastern Germany. Eastern Germany, because already 1 year after the fall of the Berlin Wall, they reunited with West Germany. West Germany put a lot of money in that. They had a very strong economy, and therefore they could survive. They could bring East Germany up to speed. I think it took maybe 10-15 years, and at the moment East and West Germany, they're more or less at the same economic level. Still there are some differences, but not. It's very rapidly equalizing. Other countries that are very successful in their transition, the Czech Republic, so the former Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic, Poland is doing quite well. Hungary is doing quite well. So these countries are now like Western nations. Of course, there is still instability. Like Hungary, I said, is an example of a country that's doing well, but it also has a leader like Orban, which well, which can be expected because these countries are very young democracies. They don't have a tradition of democracy, and leaders like this can come to power and take control. So populism, etc., is rampant in this area, but not only there, because it's also a problem in Western Europe. So this period was a period of division. It was a period where there was a period of rebuilding ourselves after World War II in the 1950s. Then in the 1960s, people were starting to revolt against the establishment, especially the young people. I think Unuzan, you went to university in this time.
Yes.
In the 60s, and so it was the period of the student revolts, where actually in Paris, in Amsterdam, in Tokyo, young people were starting to protest, and in the United States, young people started to protest against the regime. That the 50s were very much focused toward rebuilding the nation, and everything needed to give way for that. But
I can't recognize at the same time.
Sorry.
At the same period.
So the student protests in Paris were in 1968, Amsterdam 1969, Tokyo was also around that time.
Okay, around 1970, before 1970, I went to East Germany. At that time,
Right.
I didn't recognize they are very much interesting for the Western world, and I didn't recognize that at that time because although these German people are watching me with very much interesting curiosity,
Right.
but I didn't recognize at that time. But I had a better talk with those people in later 1960s.
So I went to Czechoslovakia when during in 1984, I think 1984. I was 1985, something like that. So I was a high school student, and I was very well. People were not really curious. They were very hostile and negative. It was definitely very, very gloomy, and there was a very clear dismotivation to do anything.
1980s?
Yes. So I think we went there with school 1985.
So just before Gorbachev coming in.
Right, it was before that. It was still there was no sign of any change, but I was very much taken by the we went to Prague, and it was a very gloomy time, gloomy atmosphere. It was dirty, and the living standards were okay. The control, the way that people were, and this is Prague. So this is actually within the East European countries. Prague was more or less a liberal country, but it was it was not functioning at all. Like, we would go to Parliament, and then at about 10 a.m. in the morning, you could already see people from Parliament completely drunk, coming towards the walking out of the parliament. So it was dirty, and there were people who were completely beaten up by the secret police. It was definitely.
Where is it actually coming from?
Sorry, what did you say, Peter?
Eastern Germany.
No, this is the Czechoslovakia. The
Why they are so much illustrating at that time?
I think that for partly it was normal life, and also partly is because we were from the Netherlands, and I think a lot of people misunderstood that we were from Germany, and I felt that there was a very deep-rooted hatred towards Germans.
I see. Still, they have hatred against Germany.
At that time, yeah.
But their life is almost normal. It means standard of life level is much better at that time.
Well, at that time, actually, it was not that people were extremely poor or were dying in the streets. They didn't have much. It was really compared to our standard of living. The living their wealth was very limited. But yeah, like I said, I mean, they had access to education, they had access to healthcare, they had a job, even though the job was very often didn't mean much. It was kind of useless what they were doing, but at least they had a job. And I think that was in retrospect, that was what they came to appreciate, that at least they were taken care of, and that all fell away after the wall came down.
So at that time, they don't have any doubt for their communist party or government?
Of course they had, but nobody could tell that. It was that was very, very dangerous to express your doubt, because there were spies everywhere, secret police everywhere.
But at that time, not yet the liberal movement.
No, there was no such thing. Sometimes you would see some people who would challenge the system by engaging in some illegal activities, by, for example, exchanging their local currencies for US dollars. That was something that would enable them to make money. But it was a very highly controlled society, where everywhere the walls had ears, literally, with bugs and everything in hotels, and it was very strong. It was very strong control over individual freedom, over the individual.
I see. Okay.
So yeah, actually, the world at that time, it was getting gloomy in the 1980s. Also, we had a high unemployment in Europe, in Western Europe. We had Eastern Europe, where people were very unsatisfied. So that especially the second half of the 80s was a gloomy, dark period that suddenly changed in the beginning of the 90s. But we were.
Edo-san,
yes.
That, for example, the unification and communist in Europe, it did happen in Europe. The unification in Germany and the transition of the political regime. But whereas in Asia, after the 40 years or 50 years of World War II, but still in some country the unification has not coming out, and also in some countries the communists are still in power.
Right.
Then, entirely there. Of course, there are obviously some difference in the context of countries and neighboring countries. But what I think is making these differences. So some communist country has opened up their market in terms of the economy.
Right.
But still, sometimes there's some censorship, and the people cannot say, what they're thinking.
Right.
Then sometimes business scheme is also not well modernized. Sometimes we have to follow. There's too much high context business procedure and negotiations.
I like that how you say that. Okay, yeah, I know what you're talking about. I know where you're calling from. That's a very interesting question, actually. So how come that we see the difference? So one of the reasons I think that there is a difference. For example, we talk about the systems, for example, in Cuba, in China, in Vietnam, where they still have communist systems. But I think the key difference here is that if we look at Eastern Europe, the Eastern European nations like Czechoslovakia and Hungary, etc., they did not fight themselves to get this system. They were occupied by the Soviet Union. They never chose to get the system. It was imposed on them. Whereas, for example, Cuba, and more notably Fidel Castro and his people, they fought very hard. And they came from a period that they had been suppressed and exploited by the Americans, for example. So they came from a situation, a capitalist regime, and there was a lot of corruption, and the country was very poorly led under the capitalist system. So these people actually more or less liberated these countries from capitalism. The same holds true for a country like Vietnam. They have been suppressed for a long time. They fought very hard, and they attained the North Vietnamese. They won. And therefore, we still see this system alive. Of course, they need something to validate that their economic system and the way that they rule the country, and they can do that because they bring economic success. Vietnam is growing rapidly. They're opening up their economy. They are. From an outside perspective, I'm very much an outsider, but it almost feels like a capitalist country with the capitalist economic system is joining hands with the more or less communist way of ruling the state. So it's more or less of a two-speed system, a hybrid system. But they're growing rapidly, and the people of Vietnam are probably satisfied enough not to revolt against their leaders. China is the same. The question, of course, for these countries will become what will happen once the growth ends, and that is going to happen. So will they still be satisfied with the leadership I don't know. I really don't know, but I think the key difference between why these countries still did not shake off communism, because actually for them communism is not that bad.
Yeah, I don't think I better talk a lot here. Yeah, even though I have some different, I shouldn't go too much. but yeah, if the similar will happen in these countries, and economic growth will also be different and might be much better.
I think Vietnam is a very special case for future. They are a socialist country, but their rule based on more, not so much strict like China. Intellectual property or how to control their government policy or sticking to the press freedom. Vietnam is more easier than China. So I think one of the good example in future, they are not based on democracy, but their tool is considered for more happiness for people. I think a good example in future. China is still very heavy sticking to control for the press freedom and also controlling for the kind of the governance of their how to handle people. But Vietnam is different, more loosening their strict control. So I think it's a good example in future. One type of political regime supposed to be instead of democracy is the best in the world. But I think Vietnam style some meaning some much better than like Philippines. Like example is the person per capita is Vietnam is still low, but your country does not have kind of oligarchy, so everybody equal. So I think this is like compared to Philippines, these people govern the country like America. Almost all asset is owned by rich people, so ordinary people are poor. So Vietnam and also transportation Vietnam is better than Philippines. So one of good examples. So my measurement of what is the definition of happiness, what the definition of democracy is, what is the definition of happiness. So people are happy is the best country compared with the other country. I think this means Vietnam is very good situation is undergoing even if the person per capita is $3,000, but it's much better than Philippines.
And it's much less strict than what we saw in Europe and in Soviet Union. That was much more oppressive than what we see in China today, for example.
Oh yeah.
It's surviving because it's not too strong.
Right. It's it's a trade-off, right? So okay. People there's stability, there is more or less equality, and we see that the economy is growing, it's going somewhere, so that equals more or less like the system is working for us, and these countries, they know all too well that capitalism is not always working. Cuba, Vietnam, they had terrible regimes under capitalism. Capitalism is not that great. And those people definitely realize that.
But Russia is very interesting now. Is
the country, going up, and also it seems they're going to sooner or later hit the ceiling.
Right.
For the next step of.
Right. Well, for countries like Vietnam, I think there's still an opportunity because of the very rapidly increasing costs in China. Southeast Asia still has a lot of potential to grow, and Vietnam is one of those countries that is very well positioned to grow quite some time longer. That is if Trump is not overly successful to create a trade war everywhere throughout the world, and going back to protectionism. That will be very bad news for countries like Vietnam.
Are you talking about Trump?
I'm talking about Trump.
Okay, I just listened to my recognition is different. He tried to destroy the old world order. Okay, current world order. He tried to scratch out.
Right, but
he tried to create new world order. Okay, and he had very bad point, but good point is he tried to create new world order and global equilibrium to establish. And past 70 years, I'm balancing in the world, economically, politically, everything else. So he tried to scratch it out. So that's the reason he tried to make country by country bilateral agreement, not only economy but everything else. So it means he denied European community, he denied NAFTA, he denied TTP. Everybody should be equal. He's thinking approach. This is I support him, but he had a lot of things like racist, and he had a lot of problem immigrant, had lots of problem, lots of not well-educated person. But anyway, but that point is I support him.
Right, but for countries like because the current system is very much focused on globalization, on a business process outsourcing, on bringing your production to the countries where they have the lowest cost level, given certain minimum conditions regarding infrastructure, political stability, and things like that. But Vietnam is very well positioned to actually to gain from that, because they have a low cost structure, they have a good infrastructure, there is stability. So they are very well positioned to grow in a world that is really focused on globalization. But Trump is trying to overturn that and bring back production to where consumption is, and bringing factories back to the States. Let the people who buy it also produce it, and thereby strengthening the power of the blue-collar workers in the United States, which is at the expense of the people in Vietnam who would otherwise benefit and get more work pushed in their direction.
Yeah, this is a blue-collar workers in the States is another issue. This is the kind of, what kind of action Trump will going to take, but that kind of under current position, this problem will not be solved. Right?
No.
It's impossible. Just the people stay there, no skill, no intention for studying hard, working hard. It's useless. Just we cannot take care of them. We cannot take care of them. It's impossible. So what's going to do? It's very difficult. We just only one way. We try to give them opportunity to re-educate their skill. That's all. Might be that the only way. Or government need to consider for the basic income system?
Yeah, well, that is one thing. I mean, I wonder whether, like, okay, what Trump is doing is trying to bring those jobs, those manufacturing jobs, back to the United States, not necessarily just by American firms, but also by global firms with global production standards, like Foxconn, for example, to bring those factories to the United States, which is interesting in itself. So it brings employment, but only to the extent that it will not be automated and done by robots and with the help of very smart software. So the real extra employment that it will create will probably be very limited, because that will be the new form of business process outsourcing. Not to the lowest cost countries in terms of wages, but just automation. That is where companies can save costs. And Trump himself really believes that you should save costs, not paying taxes and whatever. That's his responsibility as an entrepreneur, for his workers, for his shareholders. So he will probably realize that, okay, even though if he manages to bring factories, keep factories in the United States, not bring them to countries like Vietnam, then still, if it becomes cost efficient, these jobs will soon be outsourced to computers and robots.
That's right. Foxconn factory in the States, no employees, not like in China. Okay, and Vietnam, although, however, Vietnam is exactly the same. Now is Vietnam factory will going to be automated from now on, so they don't need blue collar workers anymore.
Right.
But Vietnam is population over 100 million, so they're going to have lots of. But by the way, I'm reading some material now in this morning before this session. John Stuart Mill or somebody mentioned at that time industrial revolution will going on, then 40% of people will going to be available in Britain. He said, John Stuart Mill, more than 100 years ago, he said, okay, this is a productivity increase, right? By industrial revolution, 40% people will going to be available. What's going to do? He said, the same thing, same phenomena is prevailing now. But like more than 150, 200 years ago, the same thing happened, or maybe we are not going to be available. But because at each era, government regime or some people need to consider for how to handle so kind of available people to be more usefully utilized.
Right.
Right. But currently we don't find Trump. He's not have a blame how to solve this solution. He just bring back factory to the States. But even he is understand that even if a factory going back to the States, no employee will increase. He understand. But I don't know how come he to bring back factories to the States. I don't know, but he try to get the tax revenue from factory. Not blue collar people. Blue collar people solution is different way. One way is 100% for sure. What Trump is thinking about next 3 years is infrastructure building. So infrastructure investment is cause a lot of employees employment. This is for sure for at least next 3 years. But for 3 years, while for 3 years, he will consider how to change those people's skill. Maybe, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But Vietnam is different. Vietnam is compared with the United States. Vietnam is very keen to for IT technology now. AI and robotics is very soon catch up with Westerners. So this goes like China. jumping technology, process just to reach into the top end technology they're going to try to adopt. So what they're going to do? This is another different problem will come because Vietnam is younger than America, and the average age is younger, maybe. So how is it going to train those people for education, investment for education? Maybe they are doing now, but I'm not sure. And also, currently, I don't know the tariff against the other world. Vietnam strategy, what they're going to do. But presumably, so far so very good for people, ordinary people.
Right. Right, but yeah, these young people, this potential, if there is no new jobs, etc., to match with that, then what are they going to do? Just like the Mexicans, what are young Mexican people going to do if no longer jobs are available? If they're going to move back to the States, then you're going to need very high walls to keep people out.
No. No. Obrador is stronger than Trump. New President Obrador is different from Peña Nieto. He is not soft, very hardliner. What he's going to do is against Trump. Okay, you're going to take all factory back to the States. Don't care. Okay, don't care. War, don't care. We don't pay. But they are thinking. Mexican people is California, Texas, New Mexico. Still they are thinking about those areas is Mexican.
Right.
Okay, but the United States, no. This is those people speaking Spanish. So Mexican illegal immigrants still moving to the States. They get in the States, no problem at all. Los Angeles airport, everybody Mexican. San Diego Mexican. Everybody Mexican. Okay, but 100 years ago, America occupied, but still Mexican people believe that's the territory of Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And the drug is narcotic is they're easy to bring to the States. So Mexico is narcotic country, and this trading is still illegal trading is still going, and illegal immigration is moving to the States. Nothing changed, even if war is going high.
Right. But it's not only Mexicans, right? So if what you see that a lot of Mexicans actually started to go back to Mexico because that's where the jobs were. But if those jobs are going to move back to the United States, that means that people will follow. Whether it be Mexicans or even Vietnamese or Indians or whoever, if they can't do the jobs within their own countries, they will go to the States.
Okay, at this point is Trump is thinking this way. He is going to scratch out everything. Okay, and Mexico is we try to abolish NAFTA. Then what's happened? Factory going back to the States. What happened? But America, they import a lot of food from Mexico, and America exports a lot of things to Mexico. So they try to select calmly, watching, observing what's going on. This is one good example. Canada. Okay, Canada is the same treatment to Mexico as Mexico, and then they started for the new tariff system started. But what's happened? It means Trump complained to the Canada, you are illegal importing American shoes with a tariff. He said, but thinking about that, their border is 800 kilometers. It's impossible to stop illegal import of product. This is too wide border lines. Nobody care about their border. So even if they charge that special tariff, this is useless. Truck and the buses, cars, everything really crossing border. So Trump understands that, right?
When you think about it, that's very strange because a country that seems to be 100% impossible to protect its borders is Japan.
Yes. So the saying, okay, saying. Then we're going to do that. Then just watch it, observe it, and if you can, what is the best way? Try to solve. So it means he is thinking about forget everything, some agreement, bilateral contract, everything else. This is just they have past 70 years. Lots of irregular, lots of not so kind of fair trade is prevailing now. Like they still German is their wrongdoing against America, so America made a concern, and China is lots of protected trading barrier they have, so force them to open. They are gradually opening now. Trump said that's the reason why Trump said they started to open that market to the rest of the world. Never happened before. So American company now can invest money to the insurance company in banking in China. Never happened before. So this is a good move. And then, but his remedy looks like a revolution, global revolution. One person tried to do that. It's very hard.
Right. But you say that you say okay that's a good way that the American insurance companies can move into the Chinese market. So to one extent maybe that is good, but on the other hand, if I look at the American insurance companies in Japan, for example, then I say what bullshit products they are offering to their to the Japanese people, like insurance. If you get
really, what do you mean bullshit?
Well, I mean, so for example, you have these insurance companies that offer insurance if you get this type or that type of cancer. So they advertise it like, okay, if you get this type of cancer, you can get insurance. But what about any other form of disease that you could attract? This is really nonsense insurance.
Oh, only cancer.
Right. It's really like this is not how insurance should work. So you should sell insurance with the objective to protect people when they get sick, not when they attract this sickness or that sickness and try to create fear in people. Japan is highly overinsured.
Oh, this is Japan is everything overprotected.
Right.
Too much democracy. Japan is the best socialist country in the world, Don't misunderstand. Must be more familiar with, overseas brutal, business way of life. Brutality there. They are invading many countries, killed, raped, everything else they did in the past many years, many decades, many centuries. Japanese never happened like this. But Japanese, something happened, so astonished, astounded, everything. Oh my God, so and so. But this is normal in the world, right? And also, Uber today is joining. I have very interesting issues for Uber, Malaysia. Mahathir, he is a very super politician. He wants to change Malaysia again. But it's amazing. He's 92 years old. but Mahathir, he wants to going to change Malaysia. Najib arrested. It's very interesting. Recently, tremendous change in Malaysia, right?
Yes.
And your country is going better. And also the food that his Mahathir supporter is I forget the name was arrested in many years in prison. He's released and he's going to succeed in the Mahathir position within a couple of years. So Malaysia will going to change. He is going to, but that country is not democracy before. Okay, now is going to. I don't know which country they are focusing for, and it's the middle between Singapore and Vietnam. It's sort of socialistic democracy, or restricted maybe, no freedom of speech. But now is how I don't know how they're going to change. Okay. By the way, going back to the discussion. By the way, what are you talking about after Cold War, right?
Right. So after the Cold War, there is the period of rebuilding the countries. The people just work hard. They see economic success, and very rapidly growing out of poverty. In Germany, we have the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, and it's happening also in Japan. These countries, they were completely destroyed after World War II, but they very quickly managed to rebuild themselves. That leads to new wealth and a new young generation of people who did not grow up in the war and do not really understand the context of war. All that they know is the wealth and stability and growing economies and lots of money being around. So they actually look at the world and they see this Cold War. They see people are working for money without taking a rest, and they start to question the system. So what is this all about? This is crazy, and they're going to look for different answers. And this is the beginning of a revolt of the youth against the elder generation, questioning their beliefs, questioning the way that they are doing things, and really starting to be serious about alternative ways of actually organizing your country, living together. Capitalism in itself is not the only answer. There are alternative ways. And this leads to the student protest movements, where students no longer can tolerate the fact that they have no democratic rights within the universities. They don't have any saying in their education, and that basically is a trickle-down effect. Very famous people today are from this generation. Bill and Hillary Clinton were young when the student protest movements in Berkeley took place. In my own country, the Netherlands, actually, a lot of the political leaders of today were students, were young and in that age. So this really actually is history, is the personal history of a lot of today's political leaders in the Western world. So let's have a look at the video.
One group put Liverpool behind them and went on to become an icon for their time.
It's mad. You couldn't hear them at all. You just screamed and cried, and just everyone was standing up, screaming and waving their arms, and it was just mad. And you didn't hear one word they sang.
I remember looking at John Lennon and thinking, I like this guy, I want to be like him. He was a hero. He was so different, even though he wore the suit and the tie. He was different. He was sort of forging a new way ahead. Even the length of people's hair changed directly because of the videos. Donald Newton worked in a music shop.
When the Beatles came along, I was a branch manager in Runcorn. And of course, the scene absolutely exploded. There was people queuing for records. Full 10 deep. I had 4 of us staff upstairs on a Saturday. On the records, then were only 6 and 8. Everybody wanted to be a Beatle, so they were buying a Fender Stratocaster guitar. It had to be in salmon pink. So everybody wanted to be a Beatlemania.
The Beatles helped give young audiences around the world a common identity and a new sense of freedom and release. Established politicians felt that even they could gain by appearing with the Beatles. Same goes for me. Thank you very much for giving us this Silver Heart. But I still think you should have given one to good old Mr. Wilson.
It's time to get down and get with it for one of the first teenage magazine programs. A whole scene going.
Puzzled at how to attract the young audience, broadcasters made earnest attempts to be less stuffy.
Because this is the first program in a new series in a new year, we start by looking ahead.
It was a time of young, brash style. A new generation of designers overhauled the fashion business. Clothes were made from new materials and produced and distributed quickly, and they sold at prices everyone could afford.
It was almost like an injection of adrenaline. It was just quite amazing. It's almost like having, when you see these films that are black and white and it suddenly becomes colour. I had the most superb mini dress. So it was exciting because, in the 50s, it was just shirtwaisters and sensible dresses and all the women, young girls' magazines were neat little white shoes and little cuffs, and you should wear gloves and hats. And I think it's just, that you were basically young, old people.
For centuries, fashion has belonged to Paris. Today, after years of absolute power, these style dictators stand assailed from all sides by cheap pop instant fashion.
Well, I went because you told me I should go. I thought it was fantastic. It's all changed tremendously, and we used to be very interested in what very fashionable women are wearing, like the Duchess of Windsor, like Jacqueline Kennedy. All these women have been influenced by the younger ladies in the street who are wearing these sort of what I call kooky clothes.
With their new self-confidence and their greater mobility and independence, young people's attitudes grew more defiant. At its high school in France, it was the regulations on hair length that first turned Romain Goupil into a rebel.
On se faisait bloquer à l'entrée du lycée.
We were stopped at the school entrance by a teacher who said, if you have hair like that, you can't come to school.
Donc il fallait être comme des moutons. Et c'était un peu...
We were all supposed to be like sheep, and that was the first tract we put out. We aren't sheep, and we won't be sheared.
On n'est pas des moutons, on veut pas ces sétons.
Romain Goupil tried to show his own growing disillusion and political consciousness with a film that he and his friends made about themselves.
Devant cette radicalisation et puis cette...
Faced with my radicalism, my parents tried to argue with me in political discussions.
Discussion politique, mais plus...
But the more they tried to be reasonable, the more I rebelled. This wasn't just true for me, but for my whole generation.
Toute cette génération, notre âge et notre vivacité et de notre façon de
Fortunately, at our age, our liveliness got us involved with other things.
Nos discussions vont porter aussi sur
going out on dates, to the cinema, into relationships with the girls we met in our political activities.
Et là, les jeunes filles qu'on rencontrait bien sûr dans ces activités. La façon...
Perhaps the best way to seduce a girl was to talk about Trotsky or the Russian Revolution.
Peut-être de parler de Trotsky et de la Révolution russe.
The new generation had more time to ask questions. They'd stayed in school longer and more went to university. In America, the number going into higher education doubled between 1945 and 1965. In Japan, 100 colleges were built in the 1960s. In Britain, 22 new universities helped cater for an extra 1.5 million students.
My sister and I were the first kids in our family who went to university. And you find yourself in an environment where you question everything and you debate everything, and the idea that there was a simple authority which everybody should respect kind of died mid-gasp.
In America, the richest country in the world, many of the new students began to turn against the consumer society that they themselves had grown up with.
Parents want you to make money, go to school, have a nice job. I want to have a nice job. I'll do anything as long as I'm happy. Too many people are too careless that they we're just after the money for it, not necessarily for a job that they're really interested in.
Anybody who doesn't have an ideal is never going to do anything or go any place, because how can you be satisfied? See, you're constantly changing all the time. You have to have something as a goal.
Oh, you'd like to be my father, you'd like to be my dad, and give me kisses when I'm good and spank me when I'm bad. But since I love my parents, I've forgotten how to bow. So when I've got something to say, sir, I'm gonna say it now.
The young had new heroes, and the people they admired most were those who managed to overthrow established regimes against the odds. Students turned the revolutionary leader Che Guevara into a cult figure.
I think that international influences had become very important to us. And of course, people travelled around you. We were perhaps the first generation who could travel in that kind of way. And so it was entirely usual to run into friends, people became close friends, who were from the States or from France or from Germany. And we all got to know each other well, and we all shared each other's interests and concerns. Not just about politics, there were strong interests in the new wave of movie making and music. I think some musicians operated in effect as an underground press, some of them by expressing very, very simple messages.
Bob Dylan's protest songs were reaching a mass audience just as a new cause was emerging.
Oh, the times they are a-changing.
Opposition to America's involvement in Vietnam would unite the young almost everywhere and become a catalyst for wider change. Young men who called up burnt their draft cards in defiance of the government. But with the war escalating, others felt so alienated and disconnected that they simply dropped out. They concluded that the old world couldn't be repaired and believed they could create an alternative one of their own. Come on, people now, smile on your brother and line again together. Try to love one another. In 1967, the hippies were discovered by the media, and suddenly everyone knew about them. Their psychedelic drugs, their clothes, their vision of peace, love, and communal living.
We were anti-engine, anti-car, anti-pollution. We wanted clean water. We didn't want to eat animals. We were strictly non-violence, and I really like that strictly non-violence thing.
Many hippies moved to the country, setting up their own communities where they hoped to live by the anti-materialist ideas they preached.
We were concentrating on a very colorful, loving version of what life can be if we work together and play together. And a lot of people went off and they became very raggedy because they really didn't know how to survive. And they didn't know how to grow carrots, and they didn't know how to, dig latrines, and they didn't know how to create alternative schools, and you had to learn all that.
The hippies established a drug culture that could seem benign, but it could also be utterly destructive. In London, the American embassy in Grosvenor Square was besieged by demonstrators, including David Treisman.
There was, more than anything else, a sense of the injustice of it, and a sense of horror, perhaps at seeing the first war where day by day you saw the most appalling atrocities come back through your evening news. Small children on fire, people being shot, prisoners just being shot in front of you, it would have been a pretty insensitive population of young people in this country which didn't react to it.
And the war inspired a wider power struggle between youth and authority, which continued throughout 1968. At some universities, students attacked professors who tacitly supported the war. At others, they challenged the curriculum of the teaching. At Essex, David Treisman and his student comrades took control and proclaimed a free university.
A university seems to me to have one fundamental point, and that is to have a dialogue, not to be just talked at, not just to be taught, not just to receive edicts from bureaucrats. It is to establish a dialogue and question the whole fundamental principles of a society, including its class basis, which no university has got to yet.
The real anger and distress about the Vietnam War meant that if speakers came to a university like Essex, who were deeply involved in biological and chemical warfare, students were going to protest, and that is indeed what the protest was about.
As 1968 went on, more universities rebelled student control.
We have complete control, and we will keep it till Sunday so that we can use it for the purposes that we want.
In Paris, riot police were called into the Sorbonne to deal with a student demonstration. After a bitter clash, the police occupied the university. Angry students marched to the rescue, including the 18-year-old Romain Goupil.
It was an extraordinary display of solidarity. Between 6,000 and 10,000 students went to the Latin Quarter. The overturned cars. We put up barricades around the students. As has been done traditionally in Paris for a long, long time. We found ourselves behind the barricade shouting, "We shall not be moved." We learned a lot of lessons from the United States, from Germany and Italy, and we defended ourselves, which led to a really violent confrontation.
Eventually, the police and the students took over France's most respected university. The courtyard was transformed into a festival of art, philosophy, and revolution. An open seminar on how the university and France could be reborn.
Everything that hadn't been said for years was coming out, and everything we wanted for the future. The most utopian speeches, the most far-fetched revolutionary ideas were going to see the light of day. A sort of huge talking.
On May the 13th, 300,000 Parisians turned out in support of the students. The communist trades unions led the way, raising student hopes that the workers might join them in a Marxist revolution.
What sparked up the general movement in France was, above all, the violence against the students, police violence. Basically, we workers can't stand that.
France was hit by a wave of strikes. All over the country, workers occupied their factories, demanding better pay and shorter hours. The rest of France joined in, virtually everyone from architects to farmers. It looked as if the students' protest might bring the radical changes they hoped for.
There was no petrol, no trains, no cars, no television. Nothing.
Et donc, il y a une espèce de fou rire en disant chacun est responsable.
Everyone was on strike, and there was a kind of giddy feeling that we'd all played a part in jamming the wheels of government.
Le gouvernement.
But when students marched to an occupied factory to join forces with the workers, they didn't get the reception they expected.
À la radio, on apprend que we heard on the radio the students were on their way. Alors, à partir de là, so we locked all the gates.
The students begged to be let in, but the workers feared they'd destroy the factory.
Le jour après la strike was over, they'd have to go back to work to feed their families. We couldn't allow them to damage our machines. What would have happened then?
The interests of the workers and the radical students were too far apart. By the end of May, it was all over. Though the universities themselves were reformed, the wider revolution was not to be. Within a few years, the US withdrew from Vietnam, responding to opposition to the movement started with the young and then spread far wider. With the war over, the binding source of protest was gone. For those who wanted to fight them, there were new causes. Some were embroiled in a different kind of struggle for black identity and power. Hippie ideas lived on with the environmental movement. Others fought for women's rights and gay liberation. And as one generation merged into another, and the rebels of the 1960s became the parents of the 1970s, some lost their sense of outrage altogether. Nevertheless, a major shift had taken place. Young people's ideas had won out, permeating and transforming almost every part of society. In music, design, and fashion, the young now set the style. In Britain, laws affecting divorce, abortion, homosexuality, and obscenity were relaxed.
I'm with you, I can't control myself.
In America and Western Europe, many of the old rules and conventions that had still inhibited people in the 1950s had been replaced by a new freedom and openness.
Well, a lot of it was the pop stars. John Lennon openly started living with Yoko Ono, didn't he? And things like that. And then you'd see people, like, read the papers, they were having children, and they were calling them a love child. So why? I mean, we call them the posh people. If the posh people can do it, why do our mums think that if you get pregnant, that it's wrong?
The days have gone when youngsters were seen and not heard. The new generation of teenagers weaned on pop, pot and protest will be the first in British history with a voice at the seat of power. For today, young people can drink, gamble and marry before they're 21, and now at the age of 18, they can vote.
If the young had failed to shake up politics as fundamentally as some radicals had hoped, at least they'd now been acknowledged. Britain lowered the voting age in 1969, and within the next few years, France and Italy followed, bringing in millions of new voters.
How does it feel to vote now, Daisy?
I suppose it's quite exciting for the first time.
In the tougher economic climate of the 1970s, idealism and energy were sapped by worries that hadn't been there in the 1960s.
While Britain 1976 will produce 5% more graduates than ever before, there will be 10% fewer jobs for them to go to.
Graduates and school leavers were less secure, more worried about jobs in the future. Nevertheless, they were moving into a world that had been transformed. The changes of the 60s would live on.
It always takes time. The Cultural Revolution was brought about by the baby boom. 1968 had immense consequences for France.
It took away the assumption that the sovereign knows what he's doing. I don't think anybody is confident to
to let the king have his way without questioning him.
We weren't going to be satisfied with the world of the 50s, where there always seemed to be somebody who had more authority, was often older, certainly always told you what your place was. I don't think people were prepared to live with that anymore, and that was a real change during the 60s, and that'll never be undone again.
Okay, it's time.
Yes, I think the video more or less speaks for itself. It's the time with economic prosperity, security. Young people have more time. They spend more time in school, more time to think. They are questioning authorities, and they started to get their influence because this is a movement that the parents cannot stop. Authoritarian, I think, is a movement that comes up, and this is something that played a very important role in Europe. Authoritarian movement is very strong and still has deep roots in Western European culture today.
Why they had sort of a student movement at that time happen?
I think that there were a number of reasons. I think there was a big gap between the parents who lived through World War II, who had seen everything, who had known poverty, known hunger perhaps, who were working hard with a very simple goal in mind, to rebuild what had been lost during those years. A very single-minded, narrow-minded approach, and then you had the children who grew up in a world with a growing economy, with jobs for everyone, who didn't have that single-minded approach. That they had more time while they were studying. They had more time to question things that they saw around them, like Vietnam, crazy stuff, stuff that didn't fit into their picture, and they were told what to do, and they questioned that. So why would I listen to this? Because who are you to tell me what to do? That, I think, was what was behind that.
It means they got the time and space for rethinking their situation.
Right, and the means to do that, the time and the money actually to do that. Their parents had made an economic success. Jobs would follow. That was not really an issue, but people had more time to think why, and they didn't really understand the background they didn't really understand the parent, but those parents have been grown up obeying authority as a natural way of life. Basically, you have to respect your parents, right? That's what's very important in Japan, in Japanese culture. But that was very seriously, fundamentally questioned by the youth in the 1960s.
Okay, so by the way, what are you going to do this Saturday?
Philosophy.
Huh? You continue?
Yes, philosophy. So we're going to step away from history. Basically, we in very quick steps looked at Europe and how European culture developed throughout time. Now we're going to look at philosophy and make a comparison between Japanese philosophy or Confucianism and Western philosophy to understand the very I think, fundamental differences in thinking between Japan, China, and Western Europe.
Oh, are you going to get into spirits or based upon my book next week? This week?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, all done. Well done.
Okay. Thank you very, very much. Yuva, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Okay.
She is very calm. The first time, so he can speak out her opinion, yet it takes several times. Okay, no problem at all. Okay.
Takahashi-san.
Yeah, Takashi is there joining now.
All right. Okay. Let's continue on Saturday.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Oh, bye bye.
Okay.